Okay, next I want to talk about some of the physical geography of Europe. I want to take a moment, just one slide, to talk about languages. Um, most of the languages, not all, but most of the languages in Europe are part of what's called the Indo-European language family. And this is a language family that at one time was sort of like this one kind of group of languages that as people kind of moved from maybe somewhere around Turkey, people are still working on figuring this out, outward into Europe, but also into other parts of the world. They brought these languages, and these languages, these are kind of prehistorical languages that then evolved over time into many of the languages that we have today. Now, in Europe, just to preview, in places like Iran and India, Pakistan, they also speak Indo-European languages. They are kind of rooted from the same branches of an ancient language. But in Europe, they're kind of fall into four general categories. Latin-based languages like Spanish, Italian, French, and more in the south, along the Mediterranean, more associated with the Roman Empire. As you go further north, you have more Germanic languages, which would include English. And then as you go to the east, you have more Slavic languages. So I guess it's actually three. And then you have a number of kind of smaller minority languages. For example, Finnish is different. It's actually not an Indo-European language, part of a Uralic group, like the Ural Mountains. It's kind of for people who kind of migrated at different times. The Hungarian language as well is kind of from the people who had migrated over, from in Asia at some point. You have some of the Baltic languages are a bit different, and also some like, for example, Celtic. That Celtic languages are an older language of, say, the British Isles and parts of France and even part of Spain, that at one time they were a dominant language in the British Isles, but as other people kind of moved in, it's been displaced out to the edges of places like Ireland. So I'll also highlight a couple of other ones. The Basque language, which is actually quite unique and older language that's in the mountains between France and Spain. And also Catalan, which is more closely related to Spanish, but is a variant of the Spanish language here in Spain. And we'll talk a little bit more about these two in particular, and also the Celtic languages, because these also happen to be regions where people want to have more independence. Sometimes their culture is different, and sometimes that's even includes language differences as well. But probably one of the key things to talk about when it comes to the European realm is the European realm is considered the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. And the United Kingdom or England back in around the 1750s, and then spreading into much other parts of Europe, and then other places like the United States. Much of it was brought about by new technologies, particularly the use of, for example, steam power. Initially, it was paddle power, rivers, moving paddles. With the development of the steam engine really kind of helped to boost the Industrial Revolution. But it wasn't just about power, but it's also about new ways of working and more specialization of work, where rather than having one sort of artist doing every component of creating an object, you have people doing small series, each person doing kind of repetitive tasks, at their station. And then so by breaking up work into multiple small tasks, it created a lot of efficiency, but it also allowed for some automation too, because you have this new steam power engines and things like that. So let's say one person's job is just to move something back and forth. Well, you can replace that person with a steam engine, because a steam engine can just move something back and forth, right? So by breaking people's jobs from being very complicated to very simple steps, it leads to a lot of automation. And in addition to work specialization, you ended up having a lot of specialization by regions. So this is called local functional specialization, where geographic regions start to specialize in producing specific types of products. So for example, the cotton was brought from the American South into part of the United Kingdom, into part of Great Britain or United Kingdom, where they used it to make textiles. Some places were had more coal than other places, but the different places would specialize in producing different kinds of goods. Now, but let's also talk about demographics too, because the last time we mentioned the Industrial Revolution, one thing we talked about is that that's a period of time when you had a decrease in the death rate and a massive amount of population growth. And this really started out in the European realm. And we've discussed this before. I'm going to just kind of continue on. And so this is called the demographic transition model. And the demographic transition model is really based on what happened in Europe from before the Industrial Revolution, through it, and then what's happening today. So prior to the Industrial Revolution in Europe, Europe was, well, much like other parts of the world, people had a lot of kids. Now, and there was a high mortality rate, particularly with young children, that a lot of children died young. But anyway, there was a high birth rate, high death rate. During the Industrial Revolution, one side effect that started to happen, maybe with the changing of how food gets distributed, scientific advances in sanitation was a big part of that coincided with that period of time when people lived in cities and people started to understand sanitation better. Whatever for multiple reasons, the death rate started to go down. And as the death rate goes down, but the birth rate stays constant, that changes the population growth rate, where it starts to really ramp up and increase. And more recently in Europe, what's happening is that the birth rate is catching up. In fact, in some instances has surpassed the death rate. So now you have less childbirth than you do people dying. And so what that means is that the population is not growing, and it's also aging, that you have more older people in the population, fewer younger people. So for example, this is a population age structure diagram, a population pyramid, showing comparing Europe to Africa. And the way these work, I think we've talked about these before, but I'll include another explainer video just in case. The way these work is that these are categories of ages of different age groups at 5-year increments. I think we did talk about these in the introduction. And the way it works is that if it's skinny on the bottom, there's not as many young people. If it's white on the bottom, there's a lot of young people. So in Africa, Africa is a continent that is dominated by younger people because they have a higher birth rate. People are having more children. Whereas in Europe, people are having fewer children, so there are more people in these middle age groups and not an excess of people in younger groups. The United States has a demographic pattern similar to Europe, but at least until fairly recently, we've had generally a higher birth rate than in Europe. Although there are some signs that we're starting to catch up in the last very recent couple of years, that we may be starting to kind of, Europe is kind of like where we're kind of going in the future. All right, so this is called the demographic transition model. And it's based on what happened in Europe from before the Industrial Revolution till today. And the idea is that you have these different stages that a population goes through, and that the most recent one is called the post-industrial. This is where, and the post-industrial is where you have these low birth rates, and you have either a stagnant or a shrinking population. And the reason for that has to do with what's called the population replacement level. This is there is some number of births that you have to keep your population steady. And, just think about, like, why is that a problem if you don't, right? Let's say if you have a population where, let's say theoretically, let's say half the population was 65 or older. Let's talk about in the United States. Now, why would it be a problem if half the population of the United States was 65 or older, and the other half was under 65, as opposed to maybe just 10% of them? Right? All right, so think about retirement, Social Security, Medicare. These are benefits that go to people in their older age, and these systems were set up when there weren't that many people that were old compared to the number of people who were young and working. But one side effect of the demographic transition is that if you don't watch this, you can have too many people who need support from the state through Medicare and Social Security, but not enough people who are younger and earning paychecks to support them. And Europe has kind of run into this issue because they have a lot of social support for their older folks, but to kind of keep their economies running, what they have to do, they have to find a way to get around this. So one way they get around this is through migration. So there's massive amounts both selective and non-selective migrants now, refugees, but initially, historically, high amount of what we call selective migrants, people moving in to get work. And more recently, we've also had a high number because Europe needs migrants. Europe is very accepting of migrants to the country, and so that's also fueled a lot of refugees, which are also people who maybe can help fill that workforce as well. So for example, Germany has taken in massive amounts of refugees, maybe to like 1 million refugees from the Middle East and other places. Many of them have come because of the conflicts in Syria and other parts of the Middle East. Some of them come because of conflicts in North Africa. And some of them even come from the old Soviet Union or parts of Russia where there's a lot of poverty currently. So the way that Europe can get around this is by accepting millions of new immigrants each year. You get a 2-for-1 with migrants is that one, they tend to be younger than the average population. 2, even though people don't have that many children in Europe, many of the migrants may come from areas of the world where people tend to have more children, and so they may have larger than average families. And so not only do you have these younger workers, but also more kids that come with them as a package. Now, this is by far not a smooth thing as well, because as you can imagine, that high influx of migrants also comes with backlash. We see this in our own country where particularly when economic circumstances are difficult, there can be these movements of backlash against migrants. They get blamed for taking people's jobs or whatever kind of problems that are in society. They're kind of the first people that get targeted in this. So this is like a anti-immigrant rally in I think United Kingdom perhaps. This is also a one against police brutality. So a lot of the same issues that we see on TV of racial strife and problems with police and minorities, these also occur, although in not quite the same exact way, but these occur in Europe as well. So we've talked about selective migrants who come to get jobs, but increasingly Europe is becoming home to a lot of non-selective migrants, like refugees is what we tend to call them, who are responding to push factors, starvation, war, and those types of things. So, and particularly when the Syrian war was really at its height, massive amount of migrants have been kind of coming, walking, taking leaky boats, and coming by all kinds of different means trying to make their way to Europe, because Europe has fairly generous refugee policies. One reason being is that they have a history of accepting migrants, so their laws are better structured than the United States, for example, for accepting migrants.